The history of science is the study of the development of science and scientific knowledge, including both the natural sciences and social sciences. The history of the arts and humanities is termed the history of scholarship. Science is a body of empirical, theoretical, and practical knowledge about the natural world, produced by scientists who emphasize the observation, explanation, and prediction of real-world phenomena. Historiography of science, in contrast, studies the methods by which historians study the history of science. The English word scientist is relatively recent, first coined by William Whewell in the 19th century. Previously, people investigating nature called themselves natural philosophers. While empirical investigations of the natural world have been described since classical antiquity, for example, by Thales and Aristotle, and scientific method has been employed since the Middle Ages, for example, by Ibn al-Haytham and Roger Bacon, modern science began to develop in the early modern period, and in particular in the scientific revolution of 16th and 17th century Europe. Traditionally, historians of science have defined science sufficiently broadly to include those earlier inquiries. From the 18th century through late 20th century, the history of science, especially of the physical and biological sciences, was often presented in a progressive narrative in which true theories replaced false beliefs. Some more recent historical interpretations, such as those of Thomas Kuhn, tend to portray the history of science in different terms, such as that of competing paradigms or conceptual systems in a wider matrix that includes intellectual, cultural, economic, and political themes outside of science. Early cultures. In prehistoric times, advice and knowledge was passed from generation to generation in an oral tradition. For example, the domestication of maize for agriculture has been dated to about 9,000 years ago in southern Mexico, before the development of writing systems. Similarly, archaeological evidence indicates the development of astronomical knowledge in pre-literate societies. The development of writing enabled knowledge to be stored and communicated across generations with much greater fidelity. Many ancient civilizations collected astronomical information in a systematic manner through observation. The physical structure and chemical makeup of the planets and stars was not a consideration for ancient people, the emphasis instead tended to be on the relative positions of celestial bodies, with inferences often being made about the effect of this positioning on seemingly unconnected earthly factors. This demonstrates a peculiarity of modern science by comparison, where its ancient equivalents generally incorporated intuition and had the concept of an assumed interconnectedness between all things at their center. Intuition and general assumptions are, in modern science, not considered appropriate or productive. Basic facts about human physiology were known in some places, and alchemy was practiced in several civilizations. Considerable observation of macroscopic flora and fauna was also performed. Africa. Ancient Egypt made significant advances in astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. Their development of geometry was a necessary outgrowth of surveying to preserve the layout and ownership of farmland, which was flooded annually by the Nile River. The 3-4-5 right triangle and other rules of geometry were used to build rectilinear structures, and the post and lintel architecture of Egypt. Egypt was also a center of alchemy research for much of the Mediterranean. The Edwin Smith Papyrus is one of the first medical documents still extant, and perhaps the earliest document that attempts to describe and analyze the brain. It might be seen as the very beginnings of modern neuroscience. However, while Egyptian medicine had some effective practices, it was not without its ineffective and sometimes harmful practices. Medical historians believe that ancient Egyptian pharmacology, for example, was largely ineffective. Nevertheless, it applies the following components to the treatment of disease: examination, diagnosis, treatment, and prognosis, which display strong parallels to the basic empirical method of science, and according to G.E.R. Lloyd played a significant role in the development of this methodology. The Ebers Papyrus, c. 1550 BC, also contains evidence of traditional empiricism. Ancient Near East. From their beginnings in Sumer, now Iraq, around 3500 BC, the Mesopotamian people began to attempt to record some observations of the world with numerical data. But their observations and measurements were seemingly taken for purposes other than for elucidating scientific laws. A concrete instance of Pythagoras' law was recorded, as early as the 18th century BC. The Mesopotamian cuneiform tablet Plimpton 322 records a number of Pythagorean triplets, 3, 4, 5, 5, 12, 13. Dated 1900 BC, possibly millennia before Pythagoras, but an abstract formulation of the Pythagorean theorem was not. In Babylonian astronomy, records of the motions of the stars, planets, and the moon are left on thousands of clay tablets created by scribes. Even today, astronomical periods identified by Mesopotamian proto-scientists are still widely used in Western calendars such as the solar year and the lunar month. Using these data, they developed arithmetical methods to compute the changing length of daylight in the course of the year and to predict the appearances and disappearances of the moon and planets and eclipses of the sun and moon. Only a few astronomers' names are known, such as that of Kidanu, a Chaldean astronomer and mathematician. Kidanu's value for the solar year is in use for today's calendars. Babylonian astronomy was the first and highly successful attempt at giving a refined mathematical description of astronomical phenomena. According to the historian A. Ebo, all subsequent varieties of scientific astronomy, in the Hellenistic world, in India, in Islam, and in the West, if not indeed all subsequent endeavor in the exact sciences, depend upon Babylonian astronomy in decisive and fundamental ways. Greco-Roman World. In classical antiquity, the inquiry into the workings of the universe took place both in investigations aimed at such practical goals as establishing a reliable calendar or determining how to cure a variety of illnesses, and in those abstract investigations known as natural philosophy. The ancient people who are considered the first scientists may have thought of themselves as natural philosophers, as practitioners of a skilled profession, for example, physicians, or as followers of a religious tradition, for example, temple healers. The earliest Greek philosophers, known as the pre-Socratics, provided competing answers to the question found in the myths of their neighbors: how did the ordered cosmos in which we live come to be? The pre-Socratic philosopher Thales, 645–46 BC, dubbed the father of science, was the first to postulate non-supernatural explanations for natural phenomena. For example, that land floats on water and that earthquakes are caused by the agitation of the water upon which the land floats, rather than the god Poseidon. Thales' student Pythagoras of Samos founded the Pythagorean school, which investigated mathematics